Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a really interesting gentleman to introduce you to tonight. His name is Robin Horsfall. He is a former SAS soldier. That's Special Air Services in the UK. He's a writer, he's a veterans campaigner, and he's a public speaker. He's coming to us from London, England. He is a international affairs expert, a military expert. He's been blogging and writing quite extensively on the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I was most intrigued recently by a post that he made about appeasement and how appeasement is completely wrong and something that we should not be considering. So I reached out to Robin and he agreed to join us here in Toronto for an interview. Mr. Horsfall, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
I'm fine. Nice to be here, Brian.
So before we get into the arguments that you've made on social media, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about who you are and your background, if that's possible, sir.
Sure. I joined the British Army when I was 15 years old in 1972, when the school leaving age was 15. I was a paratrooper at the age of 17, a Special Air Service soldier, that's British Special Forces, at the age of 21. I left the British Army at the age of 28 after having served 5 tours of Northern Ireland, fought in the Falklands War, and I was part of the famous team that raided the Iranian embassy in London in 1980 and rescued 19 hostages. I was a bodyguard, a mercenary. I started a martial arts school in southwest London and taught for 20 years until I broke my neck and handed it over to my son. What could I do then? I became an undergraduate at the age of 56. And graduated at 59 in English Lit and Creative Writing. And so I couldn't do what I used to do, so I became a writer and a speaker and a blogger, I guess. I'm opinionated. I like it when people politely disagree with me and we can discuss things. Ukraine's been one of the leading elements of my focus in the last few months.
Unbelievable, quite fascinating. So tell me about some of the posts that you've posted recently, and the one that as I mentioned, I was most intrigued by was you said appeasement was completely wrong, and you used some historical examples of appeasement that did not work. Tell us a little bit about your opinion on that, sir.
Yeah, our security depends on our defense systems. And as much as we like to believe that we live in a safe and secure modern world where we would never as human beings go back to doing what we did in the past, history teaches us that there's always going to be another war, and that wars usually develop from having somebody with overwhelming power and somebody who is weak, because bullies don't attack the strong, they attack the weak. People believe that they can buy off the enemy. That's like buying off a blackmailer. It doesn't work. They simply ask for more and more and more. The historical examples that I'd used were clearly the Second World War, with France and England predominantly appeasing Adolf Hitler and Germany, allowing them to annex Austria, Czechoslovakia, and finally only coming to warfare when they invaded Poland. Had they had the courage or the understanding that how to defeat a bully before that, then perhaps a Second World War wouldn't have taken place. But we're always clever in hindsight. But where the Ukraine war is concerned, the writing was on the wall for everybody to see, long in advance. But I was screaming on social media that there were 100,000 troops getting ready on the Ukrainian border, and the press weren't interested. They were interested in their local politics. In Canada, you were interested in yours. In UK, they were interested in Boris's Christmas party. In Europe, they were interested in how to punish Britain for Brexit. But nobody was concentrating on the fact that here we are with 100,000 Russian troops about to invade Ukraine, and everybody was saying, no, they wouldn't dare. Well, they did dare, and they dared because NATO had got fat and flabby and useless and cheap. And added to that, you've also got world leaders like Donald Trump undermining NATO with their comments, withdrawing troops from West Germany, and people, and giving Vladimir Putin the impression that the world wasn't interested in Ukraine and whether or not they invaded a sovereign state.
So some people think that this war started in 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia, and then other people would say 2014 when the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the Donbass regions occurred. And other people think no, it was in February of this year. What's your assessment as to when this war started and what we should have done at different time periods?
Yeah, we can go back even further to the early 2000s and go back to when it was discovered that there were huge reserves of oil and gas under Ukrainian territory. Now, Senator John McCain of the USA, he actually described Russia as a gas station serving Europe. Now, all of a sudden, you've got Ukraine with oil reserves and the distance is halved. So somebody's going to open a new gas station closer to, and that was closer to Europe, and that was going to be a genuine economic threat to Russia. So where do those gas and oil reserves sit? They sit under the Donbass and under the Crimea. So he doesn't need to go in and take them. He just needs to stop them being used. So there was while he had his puppet leaders in Ukraine, then he didn't have to worry about that. But later, with the election of Zelenskyy, the anti-corruption mandate that he had, things have changed. Ukraine was leaning towards the EU. It was leaning towards becoming a member of NATO. And whether or not that's a problem, the simple fact was the real threat, in my opinion, was that these gas and oil reserves would become available. Exxon, Chevron, and Shell went in to develop those oil reserves, but they got put off because of the insurgency in Donbass and the annexation of Crimea, and they withdrew.
Fascinating. I didn't know that part of the story. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Robin Horsfall, an expert in military activities, someone that's got really quite an incredible career in the British Armed Forces and has become a real commentator on what's going on in the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everybody, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're talking tonight about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and our guest is Robin Horsfall. He's a former SAS soldier in the UK Armed Forces. SAS stands for Special Air Soldier. Is that correct?
Special Air Service, Brian.
Special Air Service. I apologize. He's a writer. He's a veterans campaigner, and he's a public speaker. And he's told us a little bit about his background, which included, tours of duty in Northern Ireland, participating in the invasion of and taking back the Iranian embassy in London, England. Amazing, and numerous other things. And maybe we'll come back, sir, and talk a little bit more about your experiences a little bit more in the future. But lately, you've become a writer and a commentator, and particularly in regards to the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We were just talking about oil and gas reserves in the Donbass region, but also, given your appeasement comments earlier, what should we have done? What should the West have done in 2008 when Putin attacked Georgia, or 2014 when he attacked Donbass?
Yeah, I think we should have taken a much stronger line, but I always try to shy away from that wisdom in hindsight situation, what we should have, could have, and would have done. Really, it's more about what we should be doing now, because it really offends me when everybody thinks that they know what the leaders of our government should have done, and not think carefully enough about the circumstances. Barack Obama had a sort of lame duck second term where he wasn't getting any support. He'd withdrawn his troops from various parts of the world, tried to get out of Afghanistan. And so to go back into another conflict would have been very, very difficult for him. So it was very hard for him to put his foot down. Europe was concentrating on things like Brexit. So they weren't really particularly focused on what was happening in the Black Sea and Ukraine. And so they couldn't really see what was going on back then. They were more worried about what was expedient, what was going to keep the world economy turning over. But in the last 6 to 12 months, the writing was there. It was obvious that Putin was going to invade, and everybody turned a blind eye to it. They hoped it wouldn't happen. There were lots of other things that they didn't expect. They did not expect Ukraine to be so strong in its own defense. They didn't expect them to stand up so well in the initial periods. But there were huge errors made by the Russians as well.
Before you go on, sir, who's they didn't expect? Is that Putin and the Russians didn't expect, or is that frankly the whole world?
Sure, the Russians did not expect. They had intelligence about Europe. They felt that the West was weak. Russia was relying on a Trump victory to give them a free ride into Ukraine. The West was arguing about all sorts of petty issues, and nobody was focusing. So they perceived the West as really quite weak and pathetic. Whereas the Ukrainians, they didn't do their intelligence on Ukraine. Ukraine had invested in its army for the last 15 years, getting training from Canada, USA, UK, Israel, and other countries. They had actually brought their armed forces up to date in a way that Russia really wasn't aware of. And with the shoulder-fired weapons like the NLAW and the javelins, then all of a sudden their armor was extremely vulnerable to attack. They tried to use maneuver blitzkrieg tactics at the worst possible times of the year. When the ground was wet, armor couldn't deploy over the fields because it would have got stuck in the mud. So a whole army got and they got seriously damaged and had to retreat, the whole army. So they've gone back. They've had to move their forces across to the Donbass and hope to gain some kind of victory in the future. But I go back to appeasement because that seems to be the focus of what we talk about at the moment. If we submit and try to compromise with an authoritarian government that is focused on domination of an individual country, then what are we going to do when they then take on another country like Lithuania, any of the Baltic states, Estonia and Latvia? What happens when he then suddenly wants to move further forward with his campaign? Are we going to appease them again? Because you encourage authoritarian leaders by submission. You have to stand up. People are arguing about the nuclear threat. Putin is rattling his sabers and beating his drums and talking about it in the hope that it's going to impose fear. But you can't submit to Emperor Vladimir simply on the grounds of what he's threatening to do. Otherwise,
can you seriously risk a nuclear war?
No, I don't believe he would, but I believe the threat of it will frighten a lot of people in the democracies into some form of appeasement.
Well, hasn't a cold winter and high gas prices to a certain extent, threatened such that a lot of people are more worried about their own car gas prices.
That's right. Self-interest is always going to be a dominant factor in our comfortable world, in our democracies, because we don't value our democracies enough. We've forgotten that we've had to fight for our freedoms. We've had to defend against authoritarian governments in the past, and we've had to lose people. I said at a meeting with the ambassadors in Panama last week that Ukrainian children are dying today so that our children don't have to die tomorrow. And I actually honestly believe that. We have to support them. We have to give them our treasure. We have to give them our arms and ammunition and support. And we have to help them defeat Russia.
So the Secretary of Defense in the United States a couple months ago, maybe a month ago, said that one of the objectives of the United States was to weaken Russia so that it could never do this again. Was that a mistake for him to say that, or is that the truth?
No, I think that's the truth. I think he speaks very clearly and eloquently. He's making it absolutely clear without trying to escalate the situation that America, the USA, will support and defend Ukraine for the long-term future. It's very important to maintain the narrative, maintain the story, keep telling the people that this needs to be done and why it needs to be done. Otherwise, everybody just starts to sit around and complain about the price of how much it costs for them to drive to the mall in their car. And they forget what's really going on in the world today and how important it is for the future.
The president of France, Macron, said something, and I'm going to paraphrase this imperfectly, but something like, "We need to make sure that we give Putin a reasonable exit ramp, and that he can walk away from this without embarrassment." And that, a lot of people suggested, was effectively appeasement. What do you think of the French president's position?
Yeah, I think that's political wisdom. If you paint somebody into a corner and don't give them some form of exit, especially in an authoritarian state, then the future may be less predictable. So allowing him to save face and retain power in Russia is probably going to be the exit ramp that they need. But what President Zelenskyy needs is he needs his land and territory back. Otherwise, it's going to be viewed as a military success and an occupation of his country. And so there's the dilemma, there's the conflict. But I also want to shy away from criticizing a particular national leader. Every country that has come out in support of Ukraine, that's all the European countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the USA, and others that I've probably missed. They're all combining their resources together to help Ukraine defeat Russia. If we start dividing them, saying we're doing more than you, or they're not doing enough fast enough, then we start to play the Russian game. We start to argue amongst ourselves, and it becomes self-defeating. So everybody doing their part, everybody contributing what they can in the best way they possibly can, without cutting their own throats, is very important.
Okay, I agree with you. However, when Hungary or Serbia object to what the rest of Europe is doing, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's the nature of democracy. That's the nature of the world we live in. We allow people to disagree and to argue. Viktor Orban in Hungary had his own set of issues. Erdogan in Turkey had his own set of priorities and issues that he had to deal with. So talking, negotiating, trading favors, getting things done. The agreement from Erdogan for Finland and Sweden to become NATO members was very, very important and crucial, but it took 12 weeks to achieve. But it's been done. That's what we do. We can't force ourselves. We can't be telling Russia off for forcing itself upon Ukraine and then forcing ourselves. We have to negotiate, we have to agree, and we have to do the best we can in the circumstances we have. There are going to be different priorities for different people. Viktor Orban is very much a right-wing leader in Europe, and he's become a little bit isolated under these circumstances, but perhaps his political priorities are different again, but he's come on side.
Lots of people thought the leadership in Poland was very right-wing and potentially a problem in regards to NATO and EU integration and support of liberal democracy, etc. But they've seemed to have done a spectacular supportive job in this situation. What's your read of what's going on in Poland?
Yeah, every nation in the world has opposing sides in democracies. We have what we call left and right wings. As long as they're not extreme, then they're just points of view and they're arguments. Conservative, Labour, Democrat and Republican. It's only when they become extreme that they become an issue. So a lot of the time we're two brothers arguing for the same result at the end of the day. You just want to go down a different path to get there. Poland have been absolutely tremendous, not just in the immediate support they gave, because that's understandable. They were they're the next nation in the queue of being invaded and threatened, but in the way that they accepted Ukrainian refugees, 13 million Ukrainian refugees, and set the example for the rest of Europe, taking them into their arms, saying, come on, we've got to look after these people, and looking after them until they can go back to their own sovereign state again. So credit where it's due. I really want to boost up the work that political leaders have done in the democracy so far and say how well they've done, rather than simply sit back like an awful lot of the media and look for reasons to sensationalize and criticize people. It's one of the things that I write about a lot, because there always seems to be a vested interest where national media organizations are concerned.
So you think that the national media has been more critical of our domestic leadership rather than supportive of the efforts to support Ukraine? You know, the example that some people point out to is that Biden has actually in the United States done a very admirable job in supporting Ukraine, but his popularity is at unbelievable lows, lower than Trump's ever was, and the media seem increasingly focused on only what's going on in the United States, and have lost interest in, or at least some interest in Ukraine, and are focused on the January 6th hearings, on the gas prices, on people that are caught at airports with flights canceled, etc.
Yeah, I have a big problem with Western media at the moment, because I know it's their job to report, it's their responsibility to report the news, but I believe it's their responsibility to report the news responsibly. And their focus and their agenda seems to be on sensationalizing certain aspects of what is the news, and in order to excite people, to frighten people, to upset people. And their reason for that is to sell advertising. The reason for that is to get clicks. The reason for that is to get viewing figures, because these kind of emotions bring people online. They make them pay attention. They're going to steal your car. They're going to steal your family. They're going to steal your jobs. They're going to blow us up with nuclear weapons. And that's irresponsible reporting, but it gets a lot of coverage. So one of the reasons I blog on LinkedIn is there's no monetization on LinkedIn. So people can't say, Robin, you're just saying that for the purpose of earning money. Well, I'm not. I'm just doing it because it's an outlet. It's somewhere where I can get the message out there to a reading and listening audience that appreciate what I do, and I can't be accused of being mercenary about it.
Well, and you got the message out, and I'm one of the people, and there's probably lots more that have gotten the message out because of your blogging. So I appreciate that. We're going to take another break for some messages and come back more with Robin Horsfall in 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask him a little bit about the Ukrainian army and how he thinks they've actually had the ability, the attitude, the spirit to accomplish what they've accomplished, which seems like it's been against insurmountable odds, the mighty Russian army. And I'm going to ask him a little bit about what he thinks we should be doing and how we can bring this invasion, this war to an end. Stay with us. We're going to be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real pleasure of mine tonight to be chatting with Robin Horsfall, who comes to us from London, England. He is a former SAS soldier in the UK Army. That's Special Air Services. He's a writer, he's a veterans campaigner, and he's a public speaker. And at the age of 57, he went back to get his undergraduate degree and graduated in English literature and writing. And he now writes and blogs, and he's been very forceful in some of his writing in regards to the the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and what needs to happen. Robin, you've been in the armed forces. You've trained. You've been involved in some important engagements in Northern Ireland, and you mentioned the Iranian embassy and some other activities. There was something over 100,000 Russian troops massed at the Ukrainian border that invaded in late February. How has Ukraine and the Ukrainian military survived?
I think they survived because the investment they put into their armed forces over the last decade. They had training from Canada, from USA, from UK, from Germany, from Israel. So they modernized their army, which had been stuck in the old Soviet system. They trained their officers, junior officers, and NCOs to take authority and to take responsibility on the battlefield. And they also upgraded their weapon systems. So they started to bring in the new modern shoulder-fired weapons from the West. Those tactics, that investment, prepared them quite well for them to deal with the invasion from Russia. The Russians call it a special military operation, which means they are not at war according to their laws. So they managed to mobilize 150,000 of their standing army and send them over the border. They got them stuck on a single road to Kyiv, and they got really badly mauled and sent home with their tail between their legs. That was down as much to Russian ineptitude as to anything else, as to the strengths of the Ukrainians. But the Ukrainian people are very, very forthright and strong. They're not scared of a fight. And it's their land, their territory, their homes, and they know that old enemy. They're a nation that's been occupied and invaded over the last 100 years several times. The Germans come in, the Soviets come in, the Germans come in, the Soviets dominate Europe behind the Iron Curtain. They've been starved. They've had mass movements of people. They've had all sorts of issues that are in their living memory, and they don't want to go back there. So they're a powerful, tough, and strong people, and they're highly educated as well. So good for Ukraine. They weren't going to sit down and take it. They weren't going to appease Russia. They were going to stand up and fight. Putin, on the other hand, thought he was going to walk in, drive into Kyiv, and everybody was going to compromise with him, and he was going to put a new puppet government in. That was going to be the end of the job. Well, now he's got a long-term war, and it's not working out very well for him. It's costing him tens of thousands of young men dead on the battlefield. It's costing him a fortune in money, and it's removed Russia from the world markets. So anything that happens now, in a strategic point of view, Russia will lose. They've taken their country back 30 years in 6 months simply by this ridiculous and foolish invasion.
I've heard some estimates of between 15,000 and 25,000 Russian soldiers killed. What's your sense?
Yeah, I think that's probably a reasonable estimate. They're in the east, in Donbass and Luhansk. They're an army on the offensive, and they're relying on heavy artillery to give them an advantage, which it has up until now. However, any army that's on the offensive is going to take more casualties than the army on the defensive. They should have a 3-to-1 advantage, which they do not have, except in small limited areas. As they advance, they just simply demolish everything with heavy artillery. Estimates are that they're firing 20,000 rounds of artillery every single day.
20,000 every single day.
Every single day. And the Ukrainians are responding with less than 6,000. The advantage that the Russians have at the moment is their 152 millimeter artillery is outranging the artillery that belongs to Ukraine. As the Western artillery systems start to come into the country with trained Ukrainian personnel, then that factor will change. The artillery that we donate will outrange the Russian artillery and neutralize that single advantage that they have. They don't really have numerical superiority because they haven't mobilized their reserves. They simply have to rely on this standing army. So the advantage they have is artillery, longer range. As the MLRs, the multiple rocket launch systems, as the 155 artillery systems, the self-propelled guns, and the missiles, the Harpoon missiles, arrive from the West, and the people are trained to use them, which is what has taken a lot of time, then that advantage will be neutralized and we'll see a change on the battlefield.
So you think that even though it's 3 months, almost 4 months in, really Western donated armaments can make a difference?
Yes, they will make a difference. They can make a difference. The thing is, because they're so technologically advanced, you have to take the Ukrainian soldier out of Ukraine and train them really proficiently and intensively on those weapons before they can go back into the country. It's no good having the guns without the operators, and it's no good having the operators without the guns. So that's what's taken the time. Initially, the West tried to send Soviet material that they were familiar with into the country, but that's soon run out. So now they're sending their high-tech vehicles. The drones have been extremely effective, and the anti-aircraft defenses have also been extremely effective. The Danish Harpoon missiles that arrived in Odessa have forced the Russian Navy back out into the Black Sea 100 kilometers, and they're going to have to stay there now. They're very much in retreat. The Air Force is disinterested in flying because they've lost so many aircraft. The only thing that seems to be working for Russia at the moment is long-range heavy artillery.
Fascinating. And where are these Ukrainian personnel being trained? In Germany and Poland?
They're being trained in Germany, they're being trained in Poland, they're being trained in Britain as well. And some of them have been in Britain for the last 6 weeks, getting the intense training that's required. And as soon as they're ready, they'll go back, they'll join the guns on the border. And then those guns, there's evidence already of HIMARS and other long-range artillery systems arriving, because we can see that in the north, in Kharkiv, where all of a sudden there's an element of impact taking place on the battlefield, where you can see artillery strikes destroying ammunition stocks and destroying bases. So it's very, very accurate. It's smart ammunition as well, which means you're not going to fire 50 rounds and hope that you can kill the target. You'll fire 2 rounds and hit exactly the building or the target you wish to strike, which is a very efficient way of using artillery. The same down in the south, down in Kherson, down there, you're seeing Ukrainian advances towards that city. And if they've managed to push through in that city, then they'll threaten the Crimea. So it's a battle we're going to see these weapons change things quite dramatically over the next 4 to 6 weeks.
Really fascinating. I think we've heard about maybe 2 or so incursions of Ukrainian helicopters into Russian airspace and the destruction of fuel, tanker places, etc. in Russia itself. What do you think? Should Ukraine attack in Russian land space, airspace?
I think that we can't blame Ukraine for striking back when their country has been invaded and say, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that. It's important to try to keep the violence contained within the Ukrainian borders if we can. But if somebody's sitting just across the border with a huge ammunition stock that's feeding the army that's inside Ukraine, then it's a valid target. And if you can strike it, you should strike it. There's been a lot of incidents in Belarus and in Russia that nobody's taken credit for, where buildings have caught fire, certain things have exploded, certain parts of the infrastructure have been affected, but nobody's taken credit for that. And I think that's very wise politically. It doesn't give Putin an excuse to turn around and say that his country's been invaded and the actual existence of Russia is under threat, which it clearly isn't.
I understand that there's troops in Belarus that are massing on the Belarus-Ukrainian border, and that some commentators have said that Putin is trying to convince Belarus to attack in the north to Kyiv. What do you think is going to happen there? And
yeah,
if Belarus does attack, what should NATO the West, Ukraine do?
I think Lukashenko, as the president of Ukraine, of Belarus, has a tightrope to walk, because he needs to appease Vladimir Putin, which is where his hold on power comes from. So, but his people won't necessarily support an invasion of their friends and neighbors, which is how the Belarusians regard Ukrainians. So he's got to do something, but I don't think he will allow himself to be forced, and I don't think his people will allow him to push them over the border. But the very existence of his small and rather backward army sitting on that border may actually weaken the Ukrainian offensive on Kharkiv. So they'll be forced to put some troops there on a just-in-case basis. So they're a distraction. They have some tactical and strategic value, even if they don't come across the border. I'm sure the other side of that story is that Putin has been buying up their arms and ammunition and their artillery stocks and moving it to the Donbass. So what are they going to fight with? So there's two sides to that story which we should look at. What NATO should and shouldn't do, that's probably way above my pay grade. I don't want to become a prophet. On the other hand, the one thing they shouldn't do is allow President Zelenskyy to be intimidated and bullied into some form of surrender.
Well, you're saying you're not going to provide prognostications as to what NATO should do, but let me ask you a couple, see what you think. We're probably facing a world food crisis, particularly in the Middle East, Northern Africa, and a lot of it's because Ukrainian grains just aren't being allowed to get shipped out of Odessa. Some people have suggested that there has been some examples in the past of I don't know whether you call it a naval blockade or the opposite of a naval blockade, an opening up of the seas, and NATO could get involved in ensuring that ships can pass through the Black Sea. What do you think should happen in the Black Sea?
Yeah, the food crisis that everybody's predicting will affect African countries, and it's not necessarily that there isn't enough food, it's the price of the food going up that is one of the bigger issues. And people can't afford to buy it. If they can't afford to buy it, then they can't eat it. Then you've got the problem of starvation. Russian grain is still going out across the Black Sea, which is another huge and big supplier. Ukrainian grain, on the other hand, is being either stolen by the Russians, who are then trying to ship it out, or it's being held in silos in Ukraine and can't be shipped out through Odessa and the southern ports. It's a big problem. There are sea mines preventing ships coming in and out of Odessa at the moment. And before anything can happen, an agreement would have to be made for those sea mines to be cleared. And nobody's actually accepted responsibility for who actually put them there. They keep the Russians out, but they also keep the Ukrainians in. Excuse me while I cough. It's another part of the geopolitical picture. Opening up the sea lanes for merchant shipping to go in and out also opens the gates for submarines to go in. So there's a huge problem with coming to those agreements. Turkey have tried to become involved. There are talks going on about how it could be achieved. But we know that every time Vladimir Putin opens his mouth, he lies. You cannot believe anything he says. He will lie for an advantage, and he will tell the truth for an advantage. And that's the only reason he will do it. There's no system of morality or honor in the process that he's actually using. So everybody has to be extraordinarily cynical about anything he agrees to do. He will only agree to do something if he gains an advantage.
We're chatting today with Robin Horsfall, who is a military expert from the UK and a commentator on what's going on in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're going to take a final break for some final messages and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Well, welcome back, everyone, to a really fascinating interview that I'm having this evening with Robin Horsfall. He is a former Special Air Services soldier in the United Kingdom. He's a writer, he's a veterans campaigner, and he's a public speaker. And he's been writing quite extensively in the last couple of months that I've been following him on what's going on in Ukraine with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war, the special military operation, whatever you want to call it. And he's commented on a couple of issues quite extensively. One is his opposition to appeasement, and we've talked a little bit about that and how in history appeasement of bullies has been wrong, and how he firmly believes that appeasement today would be the wrong strategy and would only encourage the Russians, Putin, to attack again. So, Robin, you've said you don't want to prognosticate, but I've got to force you. What should we do? What's the end game here?
I think that we should carry on doing what we're doing. We should maintain our unity. The democracies should maintain their unity in opposing this unprovoked aggression, this unprovoked warfare by Russia into Ukraine. And providing we maintain that unity and we refuse to become divided and argue amongst ourselves, then we will be able to ensure that Ukraine actually comes away from this crisis, owning their own territory again, owning their own land. And Vladimir Putin and Russia think very, very carefully before they dare try such a thing again in the future.
So those that say, let's give Putin Crimea and the Donbass, what do you say to them?
Well, he already has that. So we're not giving him anything. All we're doing is just, all that would be is a form of surrender. And success to him. He will claim that he's denazified eastern Ukraine, that Crimea was always part of Russia anyway, and that he was only doing what he thought was right and it was entitled to, and it will justify that. He must not be seen to be successful outside of his own country. Otherwise, he will carry on and impose that same methodology on other countries in Europe in the future.
So the West effectively allowed him Crimea back in 2014. So you're saying that not only do we have to throw, not only do the Ukrainians have to throw Russia out of Donbass, but recapture Crimea.
I would like to see that. I think every fair-minded person would like to see that happen. Whether it politically happens, whether there's some sort of compromise, will depend on how exhausted Ukraine becomes. Their army is doing the most amazing job under the most appalling circumstances. Their people are supporting that. Their government is being extremely well led. But how long can they keep it up for? How soon is it? How much time is going to pass before they become mentally, physically, and economically exhausted? We can keep providing the money, we can keep providing the arms and ammunition that we have within our stockpiles, which are quite limited as well. So it may become a simple case of who becomes exhausted first. And when both sides become exhausted, maybe that's the time when some sort of compromise can be reached.
I think the whole world has been very impressed with President Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine, and surprisingly so, because his background wouldn't have suggested that he would have been so successful. You're a military historian and expert, and undoubtedly well-read on Churchill and the role that he played in the Battle of Britain, etc. Tell me, is Zelenskyy today's Churchill?
Yes, I think some people would fairly describe him as that. He's an actor. He was an actor, a professional actor. Well, we all know that our politicians are exactly the same. They all are required to act the part. The world's a stage and everyone's a player. So that's been an enhancement to him, but he holds on to his integrity. He leads his people from the front. He wears the uniform of his soldiers. He refused to retreat to Lviv. He stayed in Kiev. And, all those examples of doing the right thing, not the expedient thing, have placed him in such high regard with the people of the world, with his own country, and with the leaders of the free world as well. I think he's doing a marvelous job.
Robin Horsfall, thank you so much for the interview this evening. Thank you very much for your comments, and thank you very much for the posts that you are very continually posting, because I do think that you're reaching out to a lot of people worldwide in support of Ukraine and in support of NATO, against any kind of appeasement that some people might consider, and reminding us all that high gas prices or food prices or inflation may be the price we have to pay for our freedom and our democracy. So I really appreciate the role that you're playing, sir.
Thanks, Brian. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
That's our show for tonight. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from London, England, sir, at www.saga960am.ca. Thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.